Okay, so thank you all for joining. As I mentioned earlier before everyone was here, this is a meeting that is specifically focused on the zoning amendments for the Black Arts Movement and Business District, the BAMBD, as part of the Downtown Oakland specific plan. So I will share my screen so you can all see the presentation. And Stephanie, if you could also post the link to the presentation again for anyone who didn't see it earlier in case you want to download a copy of it. Okay, so just an overview of the downtown specific plan process. This process has been going on since the end of 2015. We've been working on a plan for downtown Oakland. It has had a number of different phases, including the initial phase in which there was a big 10-day public design charrette. And we actually heard from a number of artists and people of color and artists of color in the downtown at the initial 10-day charrette who showed up and were very concerned about the plan because they were concerned that if the plan wasn't taking racial equity into account and wasn't specifically addressing the needs of arts and culture in the downtown and culture keeping, that more people would be displaced. And so we actually relaunched the planning process in 2017 and 2018, bringing on a racial equity consultant, doing an analysis of racial disparities, and expanding our outreach. And in fact, some folks in here were on that team. Then in 2018 and 2019, we drafted a few different iterations of the plan that went out to the public for review. And then at the end of 2019, we released a public review draft plan and associated environmental review document and had a series of public hearings where we got public comments on that. Since then, we've taken the plan back and revised it to respond to comments, but we've also mostly been working on drafting the zoning amendments that will accompany the plan when it goes to Planning Commission and Council. So the zoning amendments will help implement the plan. And those include what we're presenting here tonight and have been presenting to the public over a series of meetings for the last few months. And then the idea is that once we have heard over the next few weeks and the last few months, feedback from the community about the draft zoning amendments, we will take them along with the revised final draft plan and environmental review document to Planning Commission and Council for consideration for adoption. So the objectives of the plan include an overarching vision for equity and access. The plan is divided into these topic areas of economic opportunity, housing and homelessness, mobility, safety and connectivity, culture keeping, which was one of those ones that had initially not been thought of, but then we added in response to the community pressing us to do so, which was a good idea. And then being adapted as the city developed its own cultural plan. Also community health and sustainability and land use and urban form. And then there are also some related policy objectives that are not specific to the downtown specific plan, but that are also impacting what we're doing with the plan. So those include state housing goals that include removing barriers to market rate and affordable housing production. Our draft housing element that's part of our city general plan has goals to increase housing production in general, provide a diversity of housing types, prevent displacement, and reduce racial housing segregation, as well as providing affordable housing, clearly. Our equitable climate action plan has the goal of facilitating transit use with dense housing and employment. And then we also intend to grow revenues for public services. Downtown Oakland and development and the jobs that are created in downtown Oakland are a major driver of revenues for the city that helps us provide services throughout the entire city. So the downtown specific plan has a number of different ways that it is implemented. They range from new studies, assessment of fees, allocations of city staff to work on new programs, new funding strategies. And then also one of the pieces is to update the zoning to reflect the plan objectives. And that is the zoning map and the planning code, which is the actual text of the language that the zoning map refers to. So the main components, this is just the overall approach of the zoning for the downtown specific plan in its current draft form, is to update the land use activity regulations. So that means revising the zoning map, making the zoning consistent with the specific plan and with the general plan and estuary policy plan, updating which activities are allowed by right in what areas. We're developing a series of special districts. One of them addresses sea level rise. Another one addresses arts and culture, which is the main thing we'll get into in depth today, since that focuses on the band. There's employment priority sites, a green loop and Lake Merritt channel overlay, which is designed to better help our residents access the open space, the green space, the public space that's along the Lake Merritt channel, the lake, and the estuary, as well as connecting to nearby neighborhoods. And then a freeway zoning overlay or combining zone, which tries to activate the areas under the freeway so that they're more pleasant undercrossings for pedestrians. And then the last piece is the development of the zoning incentive program and development standards. So those include revised building design standards for new development, new increased height in return for community benefits through the zoning incentive program, which I will talk about also a bit later, and then a transfer of development rights program, which is designed to protect historic buildings by transferring the ability to develop from those historic buildings to other parts of the downtown where we actually want to see taller development while we want to protect those what we call sending sites. So in the focus on the band, just a reminder for you all, or maybe some of you haven't been as involved in the band. I know some of you have been very involved in the creation and implementation of the band. It's the city's first cultural district. It was adopted by City Council resolution in 2016. Planning followed up on that. You may be unaware of this, but by creating an administrative zoning code bulletin for our staff to refer to. It's kind of an internal document that raises raises awareness among staff about what the band is and what the intent is, and also encourages staff to let applicants know so that they can help meet the goals of the band if they're interested in developing in the band or opening a business. So that's something that we've been using internally since January of last year. And then we've also proposed this overlay zone as part of the draft downtown specific plan zoning amendments. So I mentioned that we had heard some concerns at the very beginning of the downtown specific planning process. We heard, in fact, the photo in here is of a number of residents, community members, artists who came and showed up at the first meeting protesting in concern that downtown specific plan could contribute to Black, Indigenous, and people of color owned businesses being displaced by rising commercial rents, BIPOC residents being displaced, artists and arts businesses and arts organizations being displaced. We know that has happened. It was happening before the plan started. It has happened throughout this time. And we're trying to make changes in the zoning and as well as in the rest of the plan to mitigate that or to prevent it where we can. And also that it was hard to get permits for performance and entertainment spaces. So the key strategies that we're taking in the zoning amendments to respond to these are sort of by topic. Under economic opportunity, we're trying to add more flexibility in ground floor uses in some places while limiting them in other places to try and support arts uses. We're creating this arts and culture overlay. We've created a new commercial activity that is called artisan production, which is different from the former industrial custom manufacturing use, which is used in more limited places. Instead, artisan production would be allowed by right throughout the downtown. And then the zoning incentive program includes a community benefit for below market rate commercial space, employment training, and other workforce programs. And we think that the below market rate commercial space is specifically, that's designed specifically to address the concerns that we heard about businesses, particularly cultural businesses, being displaced from the downtown. In terms of housing and homelessness, we're increasing residential density along with the community benefits, including affordable housing. In addition to the affordable housing impact fees that will also continue to be placed on any market rate units that are developed in the downtown specific plan. And through the zoning incentive program, we would be providing, or developers would be providing affordable housing as well as public restrooms. And then on the culture keeping topic, again, the arts and culture overlay in the BAMBD is designed to protect cultural uses in a broad sense of the term. We've included relaxed rules for permitting entertainment and performance venues, so it's easier for venues to be allowed permits. Permitting, again, by right, that art is in production, and then providing the below market rate commercial space, which we are expecting would go to arts and cultural tenants, as well as infrastructure improvements that could potentially support the BAMBD, such as maybe new plazas for performance space, or other infrastructure improvements that would, support the goals of the BAMBD and having a lively streetscape. The objectives, so we've created this overlay, and sometimes it's referred to as a zoning overlay, sometimes as a combining zone. Officially, it's a combining zone in our planning code. And the goals are to foster arts and cultural activities in the BAMBD, to protect businesses and institutions in the BAMBD from displacement, and to reduce the cost of commercial space for arts, culture, and related community uses. So we know that the zoning overlay is not the only thing that needs to be done to support the BAMBD. We know that there's marketing, there's been a project working on banners and other cultural markers, and we will need to do more of that. There need to be improvements made to the Malanga Center and to the African American Museum and Library. To help implement the zoning incentive program's below market rate commercial space strategy, we'll be needing to develop a leasing and tenanting program to fill that space. We'll need to do ongoing business development work in partnership with Economic and Workforce Development Department, which includes their existing facade and tenant improvement program. And then we'll also need, eventually, this is kind of a pilot of a combining zone. We might want to apply that to other cultural districts as other cultural districts are developed in the future. But the zoning tools that we're going to use, and I'm going to turn this over to Neil in a moment to go through these in more depth. But the idea behind the overlay is that non-arts and cultural uses on the ground floor of some key nodes will require a conditional use permit so that we make it easier for arts and culture uses to be on the ground floor. We'd require new construction, dedicate at least 50% of the ground floor to arts and culture uses. And again, this is a very broad definition of arts and culture that Neil will get into. It's not just traditional art spaces. The theaters and galleries are included, but the idea is that any cultural use that really reflects the goals of the BAMBD or supports communities that have been harmed by racial disparities would be included in these arts and cultural uses. So again, the new artisan production commercial zoning activity is a part of the zoning tools, and then also the zoning incentive programs below market rate commercial space. So the overlay, even though the BAMBD itself, which I think originally showed up here, this shows that the BAMBD is actually a very large extent that moves all the way into West Oakland. This zoning overlay is just part of the downtown specific plan. And initially, we're recommending that there be these 3 key nodes along 14th Street. So kind of at the entertainment center of 14th Street, closer to Broadway. And then over on the western side of 14th Street, around the African American Museum and Library. And then over on the east side of 14th Street, which includes obviously the Malanga Center, businesses along there, as well as potentially the proposed jazz museum. So that's one of the questions we have for you tonight that we'll get into when we get into the discussion, which is, are these the right areas? Is this too much space to start with? Is it too little? Should we expand it more? The initial idea is that we would start in sort of smaller areas, and then we could add additional area and time if we find that these strategies are successful, but we wanted to focus it in on some like key areas to start with, to sort of test it out and see how it goes. So I am going to turn it over now to Neil to go a little bit more in depth into the overlay. And I see Eric had a question about how our arts and culture use is defined, and Neil is going to get into that.
Mhm.
So Neil.
Eric, I'm glad you asked. I will get into that in a moment. There's 3 components, as you can see here. There's an intent statement, which I'll go over in a moment. The definition of arts and culture, activities, and the actual regulations. And go to the next slide, and we'll start on the intent statement. I'm just going to read this because it's very specific, and each word is pretty kind of carefully chosen. But the intent of the BAMBD Arts and Culture Combining Zone is to celebrate and support Oakland's Black and African American community, culture, and heritage. In doing this, the zone fosters a sense of belonging for all Oaklanders, highlights Oakland's rich history and diverse cultures, celebrates and strengthens an ethnic enclave, supports a community harmed by racial inequities, and increases access to cultural expression. And this intent is pretty important because when something does require, for instance, a community or a conditional use permit, we're going to look at that intent to judge whether a project should be approved, should not be approved, or should be approved with certain conditions. The intent is to support a critical mass of arts and entertainment establishments to nurture and retain all residents, including the creative workforce, essential to recruiting and retaining employees in our modern economy, animate public spaces, improve local business vitality, public safety, and bring people together to inspire and be inspired by the legacies of contemporary manifestations of Black-owned businesses and arts rooted in the Black cultural experience, support a healthy and flourishing arts community, driving civic engagement, community involvement, and public health, serve and strengthen ethnic and racial communities harmed by racial disparities, and accomplish the general plan's historic goal to preserve, protect, enhance, perpetuate, and prevent the unnecessary destruction or impairment of properties, or hold on one second, or physical features of special character or special historic, cultural, educational, architectural, or aesthetic interest or value. And here's the definition that was asked for. Arts and culture types of activities produce, display, sell, foster, support, or disseminate artistic and cultural expression representative of the multi-ethnic character of the BAMBD. These type of activities include operations that increase cultural awareness, serve and strengthen ethnic communities harmed by racial disparities, and educate Oakland residents about arts and cultural practices and histories. And we've separated that broader definition into 2 kind of subsets. One is administrative arts and culture, and administrative arts and culture are more administrative type of activities that support the arts and culture activities and related, they might be nonprofit educational organizations, and those types of business, but they're mostly administrative type of activities in offices. These can include organizations that have missions to strengthen, serve, and educate underrepresented communities, particularly communities by the BAMBD or harmed by racial disparities. And then there's more active uses. These are more pedestrian-oriented, accessible, and active type of uses. Usually you'll find these on the ground floor, and they might be theaters, restaurants, art galleries, that sort of thing. Next slide, please.
And yeah, if I could just add that this is also, it's not just, this is where we really get into that. It's not just galleries, right? It's retail stores, it's consumer services like hair salons, as an example of consumer services, that either they're hosting rotating visual art or performances, or they're just oriented toward the specific cultures or ethnicities identified in the intent. So it's, it could be a grocery store that is serving certain like cultural needs. So that's where we're trying to be as broad as possible so that they still are arts and culture activities, but that there is flexibility within that.
Mhm. And if it is something like a restaurant, they need to do something there needs to be some sort of visual arts on the walls. There needs to be some sort of orientation towards the cultures and ethnicities identified in the intent of the BAMBD zone. So if you're an arts and culture type of activity, if you're one of these activities, you're generally they're always going to be permitted by right above the ground floor. Occasionally in some areas, you may require a conditional use permit on the ground floor if it happens to be in a node where we want an active ground floor, where we want an art gallery or a restaurant with the BAMBD type of orientation or the more pedestrian activity. So occasionally the administrative type may require a conditional use permit, but those will always be allowed by right above the ground floor, and usually, much of the time allowed on the ground floor by right. And also, new development must dedicate at least 50% of their leasable ground floor space to one of the arts and culture types of activities that were described in the definition.
And unlike the zoning incentive program, which has, affordable below market rate ground floor space, this would potentially be at market rate. But the hope of this program is that by limiting it to these uses, that a property owner would be more likely to rent it at lower prices to arts and culture types of activities, since those are the ones that are being prioritized for these spaces. And also, just as an aside, relevant aside, we are not able to put limits on on rents for commercial spaces in the same way that we are allowed to require them for residential spaces. And so that's one of the reasons that we are going about this kind of in a roundabout way to try and encourage more affordable ground floor space, as well as through using the zoning incentive program, which I can describe next. And then after that, we'll turn to any clarifying questions and then hear comments from you all. So the zoning incentive program, I mentioned earlier that one of the changes is to increase density, so increase housing density or increase basically floor space of commercial space that's allowed in the downtown specific plan area. That would be done pretty much only by participating in this incentive program. So the goal of the incentive program is to increase the density. We do want that density to happen in the downtown because it's walkable, it's full of transit, it's full of jobs. It's the place that we want the most dense development. And we want to be meeting our goals for housing development, including providing affordable units on site or through fees. As I mentioned earlier, we want to grow Oakland's economy and the tax base. And then we want to achieve community benefits above the ones that we get through our impact fees by capturing the additional value that development projects can achieve by the city allowing them that increased density over what they would be allowed now by right. And so we would be requiring a certain amount of benefit from a developer in order to achieve a certain amount of additional intensity. And then we take a portion of that, it's referred to as value capture. So of the value that the city has created, we capture a portion of that for community benefits. And as I mentioned, there's going to be we've had one meeting about the zoning incentive program, and there's going to be another one to really dive into the economic calculations that our consultant has done to actually come up with the amount of the benefit that's going to be required. But the benefits that would be provided under the zoning incentive program on site would be affordable housing, below market rate, as we said, 50% of below market rate ground floor commercial space, streetscape and open space improvements, as well as other culturally relevant neighborhood improvements. Like I mentioned, maybe it's a plaza with a performance space or performance infrastructure. Maybe it is, historic markers in the BAMBD that talk about some of the the history or the characters who are part of the history there. And then also public restrooms in building lobbies, which can support the businesses around it. Or they can provide in lieu fees. And those in lieu fees could be used for any of those benefits that we talked about, but they can also be used for job training and employment programs. And we've tried to incentivize people to provide, developers to provide the benefits on site by giving a 10% discount for on site. They would pay the full cost if they pay the in lieu fees. And it's just to help you try and visualize how the program works. On the left is what we're calling the base maximum. So it's the maximum height and intensity that a development is allowed if they don't participate in the zoning incentive program. So it's basically what is allowed currently. So they could build up to 45 feet high. The density would only be 1 unit for every 900 square feet of floor area on the site. And the commercial, what we refer to as floor area ratio, would be 2, which is not that high. And then on the right is the map for those areas in the zoning incentive program area where they could get additional intensity. So that same site that's got a little arrow pointing to it on the right could go up to 175 feet, a commercial floor area ratio of 12, and a density of 1 unit for every 110 square feet. So that is how the incentive program works. I know that has been a lot of content, both about the BAMBD overlay and the zoning incentive program we went through fairly quickly. But I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and turn it over to Laura to go through some of the questions that we have for you. We also just want to hear any comments that you have, any reactions that you have, but we also have some like targeted discussion questions. So Laura, should I turn it over to you?
Yes, was there a slide with the questions?
Yes, let me put that back up.
Okay, so I'll just read over at least some of the questions we've highlighted, but certainly if you have more comments in addition to what we have for the questions and or clarifying questions, feel free to comment and ask those as well. So the first one is, are the initial nodes of the BAM zoning overlay correct? Should they be reduced or expanded? The second question is, do you think restricting ground floor space for arts and cultural uses will be effective in supporting those uses? The third is, are we including the right activities to protect? How would you define an appropriate cultural use? We want to make sure we're getting that correct. And then the fourth one is, what other elements of the proposed zoning amendments do you have questions or concerns about? So if people could raise their hands for asking or giving us comments to the questions we've asked. And I guess if you're not comfortable raising your hand, we can put it in the chat as well, and then we can go through to answer those or highlight those as well. Tanya?
I couldn't really tell from the map, but how far into West Oakland does the overlay zone go into? Like what street does it end? And do you think there may be a need to have a similar kind of zoning overlay into the West Oakland specific plan, particularly around 7th Street?
So I can answer the zoning overlay itself only covers those 3 areas that I can show again as part of the downtown specific plan. So you can see the boundaries are the dashed line are the boundaries of the downtown specific plan area. So they are entirely within the downtown specific plan area. That said, the BAMBD itself extends like all the way through West Oakland.
Okay.
And this is designed as a pilot. So
Uh-huh.
perhaps eventually it could get extended into West Oakland, you know, maybe along the BAMBD corridor, or maybe something similar should be developed for 7th Street as well.
Right. And then I'm wondering, and maybe the rest of you all can chime in if you agree. And does it, the one near downtown, the node, should it be expanded to include parts of Swan's Market in that area? There's a lot of, I would kind of like entertainment venues that used to be around that kind of got priced out. And wondering if the rest of you, the participants, agree that parts of Swan's Market and the neighborhood around there should be included. And then I had another question about it's outside of the BAMBD footprint. Okay. I had another question also about the benefits. You mentioned streetscape and culturally relevant improvements. Wonder how much can we capture that would be used for maintenance and upkeep of the streetscapes? Ongoing, like some sort of ongoing dollar amount that could be used for maintenance and upkeep, whether or not it's city or if the district can hire private company to make sure that they are cleaned and maintained.
So I can start with that and then go back to Laura. But so through the zoning incentive program, that would probably not, we would not want to use that for maintenance because these are one-time dedications of funds. So there wouldn't be any consistency of them over time. So we would need to find other sources of funding for ongoing maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
Since these just happen when the development happens at the beginning. And yes, as Eric said, Swan's Market is not part of the BAMBD, so we wouldn't want to add it to the BAMBD, but it might make sense to consider that again at some point in the future for its own overlay.
Okay.
Laura, did you want to add anything on that?
No, I think you answered the question.
I think we've got another hand up. Bamidele. You're muted though.
Thank you. I do have one question, and it's the term that was used after the discussion of economic opportunities, housing, and homelessness and culture keeping. That was a discussion of BAM as the multi-ethnic character of it. How is that defined, the multi-ethnic character?
That's a good question. I don't think we have actually had a conversation about how that is defined. I mean, it is multi-ethnic in that I think it's sort of a pan-African diaspora from what I've read and heard. But also there is also the fact that the BAMBD, there's some overlap between the BAMBD and Chinatown. So both communities are coexisting in some of those spaces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay.
Multiple ways.
Well, thank you. I was just wondering how that was being used and defined. And so, okay. I think that perhaps needs to be defined in a document.
Okay. Thanks for that.
Okay.
Are there other questions?
I'll see these questions in the chat. I don't know if you want to read them, Joanna, or I can read them.
Yeah, so I'm seeing some comments. Iodele says the initial nodes should at least cover all of the downtown section. Since West Oakland will need another mechanism to help animate it. Okay. And it looks like Kristen is asking, how are the zoning nodes defined? Is PROW, I don't know that acronym. Is that like a parks?
Public right of way.
Yeah.
Oh, got it, or public property.
I'm always looking at the open spaces in between the buildings too. Sorry.
I think when we were looking at the overlay, I think we were actually looking for one, areas that, because one of the big allowances is for new development to have this 50% requirement. So one, we were looking at areas that could potentially put in a new building, so that we're, maybe a parking lot right now, so forth. And we were also looking at where existing cultural uses are. And then there were some areas that were, didn't really have much of a ground floor space at all because of the configuration of the existing architecture of the building. And so I think there was some of those types of reasons why some areas weren't included, as well as I think the concern we also have heard is that there are a lot of vacant ground floor spaces right now. So we also didn't want to have, if we had too expensive of an area that was restricting further ground floor uses, I think there's some concern that we may further kind of promote question of whether there still be vacant spaces. So I think we're trying to balance not wanting to make it too hard to develop these ground floor spaces where we see there is a lot of vacancies, but also wanting to promote, I think, these cultural and the BAMBD areas that we see already, thriving or having these types of uses, and trying to, sort of cluster them more together, and seeing that as the pilot of how that works. And if we see sort of this expansion that's working, then we can look at expanding the area. So those, but certainly we're open to, do we really miss an area that, should be included, that, has a business that, would fit within this, what we're talking about here, or some spaces where places could go in that we've missed. So it is, it is trying to really kind of balance these two things that are happening right now. I see Bill has his hand up as well.
I like to, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Neil, if you need to.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just wanted to add a little bit to what Laura said. I'll just take 1 second.
Go ahead.
I think it's important. We thought it was important too that we don't dilute the activities across that very long area, because it's not going to create kind of the atmosphere and culture that we want to create if it's diluted over. So if we concentrate these activities in certain nodes initially, we can get the vibrancy and kind of street character that we want, and then eventually, hopefully, kind of widen out from there.
Okay, so I guess just throwing this out along that strategy, and I've seen, these sort of approaches taken before, particularly over a longer term implementation, that you have some areas of particular focus, and then it's almost like the nodes sort of grow together, that there's some connectivity there. I guess I would just like to know what our strategies are, coalesce around our strategies for time between those nodes, over time. What are we looking at, either in terms of right-of-way enhancements or improvements, or maybe even very subtle things, uses of certain materials, maybe even in pavement, or certain things we might do along facades of buildings in between that, again, establish some sense of theme or district, or even, banners or signage or something that are used, just simple appointments to retail. And I guess, to the point I'm hearing Laura raise, that it doesn't become overly burdensome in terms of the cost, but there's still an attention to the detail where somebody knows that they're in a special area and that they're still in one, even as they walk from concentrated node to concentrated node. It's not like you have the whole aesthetic fall off in between, that there's still something there that gives you an idea of a special sense of corridor or place as you're moving from one to the other. And I mean, there are a lot of possibilities. There are good examples across the country too of folks who have, started these kind of districts up and they've had to grow over time. But you really, you make your investment in the areas that are most naturally convening or connecting, and then you let them, grow together. But with some sort of guidance, not in a haphazard way. There's some sense of what goes in that infill that gives it a sense of place.
Yeah, if I could just respond to that, you brought up several different points, including time and other factors. I think, these are sort of an initial pilot to see what we can do with zoning. But the city's going to need to put some more effort into it beyond zoning changes, like you said, banners, other sort of placemaking, as well as other, business development, business support to really grow the cultural districts. And right now the city doesn't have a full cultural districts program. So that's something that we're hoping is going to be evolving to provide more of a holistic, comprehensive structure around it than just these zoning regulations. And maybe Kristen, I don't know if you were going to speak to that or something else, but you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Joanna. This sort of following up on what I was asking about previously, and I know it may step outside of design to, the side of zoning related to new construction, but I do think that carving out those areas, like not having the continuous node, means that there are going to be hiccups sometimes. So like if people are walking down 14th and there's activation and new things that are happening right up to Broadway, and then nothing between Broadway, and when you get down to the other side of City Hall, that still is a dead block, right? So how do we, I just wanted to ask that question in case there was something more that we could do as a part of the overlays to even help our colleagues within City Hall, make it easier for us to do activations and programming, or to allow others to do that. Just like when we had an event last Thursday that was the Love Life celebration on the plaza, but a lot of the time it's not like that, and people don't really feel like they want to walk through that space. So just wanting to make sure that we're also making it cohesive in terms of what the city is doing, right, internally, which kind of overlays with what Bill's saying, like, we need to connect those dots, because all of the private sector is only focused on their, individual development.
Yeah, and also piggybacks on what Iodele is saying in the chat as well about, other strategies like pop-ups to activate the spaces between the nodes that we've called out. Great. Yeah, Eric?
So I had two kind of related questions. The first one relates to, are we proposing the right type of cultural uses? Normally, when we think of a cultural district, we think of vibrant and diverse activities. So I think that there needs to be a specific intention to make street fairs and block parties and street closures easier to happen, and to in fact encourage those things to happen. And the second one actually relates to what Kristen was saying about the plaza. A couple years back, there was a effort to organize the BAMBD merchants, vendors by Marvin X. And I think that in terms of activating Ogawa Plaza, that's really critical to driving foot traffic to the rest of downtown and to BAMBD. And I would like to see something that tries to encourage vendors and allows them to be there without a lot of red tape permitting issues, so that when visitors and tourists and residents come to the center of downtown Ogawa Plaza, aka Oscar Grant Plaza, that they're seeing something that's vibrant, that encourages them to actually want to take part in this cultural district.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've been hearing that a lot more, including from city staff, as Kristen mentioned, particularly as with the pandemic, there's less foot traffic in general. in that area. Yeah.
And I think the input given also emphasizes that zoning is just one small part of this. It's really got to be a concerted, organized effort to bring activities, including, you know, allowing fairs and street closures and all that more easily, those with the theme that the intent is outlining.
Absolutely, Neil. I'm going to follow up with Tanya to see what District 3 can do around BAMBD planning.
Great. And I just want to note that Hiroko had a clarifying question, just to confirm we're not able to establish level of affordability for ground floor spaces. Yes, Hiroko, that is correct. We are legally not allowed to set commercial rents. Can we make them affordable in perpetuity? So what we can do, what we are doing, is trying to have developers dedicate those spaces at affordable levels through the zoning incentive program. Again, we're not allowed to require it of them, but if they opt into the zoning incentive program, then we can require it of them. So that's why we're doing that program, because it's the only way that we have thought of, other than the city acquiring a lot of money and subsidizing itself, to get these ground floor subsidies. And Bill, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I guess just a couple of things really quickly. I do appreciate all the comments that have been made, and as far as programming the spaces and for major events, you know, along Eric's narrative, and having, you know, not just red tape issues be addressed in terms of the access to Ogawa Plaza. But just thinking again around the aesthetic, I think Kristen was making this point too, that we have some sense of continuity that's intended over time. Again, the thing's not going to be 100% complete day one or year one, but that we have a very clear plan of intention over the years, that as either funds become available or the capital program allows us to, or a foundation comes along to help, or, you know, some facade improvement program is awarded, or whatever it may be, that we've got some plans ready so that we're not whipsawing all over the place around, you know, some opportunity that just sprung up, so we're just going to throw some stuff up there. We need to really have a clear sense of image of what this corridor is going to be. And even to the point of understanding how art and expression also lines up perhaps with history and some sense of curation, that there is a, you know, there's a story to be told here. I mean, this corridor is being selected for a reason. And going into West Oakland, to Tanya's point, there's a history and a reason. So, you know, even along the length of this, how much might even be interpreted, or, you know, there may be copy that interprets it. There may almost be small art pieces, or again, you know, mosaics, tiles, whatever, just something that works within a vocabulary of design and form that really lets you know along this whole stretch you're in it, you know, that you're here. And it shouldn't be cookie cutter from one block to the next. There ought to be some inflection from one block to the next as you're moving, because it, you know, you are going through spaces that just don't go linearly, but there's also a sense of neighborhood on the blocks that intersect. And you're going into different spaces as you move through that corridor too. So there's a lot of potential here. And again, I just think part of what we want to do is really get a sense of the theming early on. And then finally, I guess, come to the other extreme from what Eric was noting in terms of having large, big events. At least from my sense of urbanism, some of the most wonderful streets in the world, you know, that have a theme or sense to them, they feel great whether it's just one person or two people walking along them, or whether you've got, you know, an event of 1,000 folks lining up and down. So again, just sort of think in terms of the scale and in terms of, you know, what it is that one might find along the way, you know, in terms of the history of the art or the expression, and it really gives a good sense of place no matter what the event is or how many people are in there.
Thanks, Bill. I'm also seeing Idale's question about, can the in lieu funds be used to subsidize the ground floor for cultural use if there is no developer offer of below market rate space? Because space no one can afford is useless. So through the zoning incentive program, we're trying to figure out, maybe there is some way that we can use in lieu funds to support this this sort of master lease tenanting, cultural tenanting program. The problem is very similar to the question that was asked earlier about using these funds for maintenance, which is that they are not ongoing sources. They only happen one time when a new development happens, when it comes online. And so we don't have any way of sort of predicting what those funds are going to be and how we can use them. So that's the challenge we have. There might be other sources of funding that might be more appropriate for ongoing uses, but we are trying to think through now how those in lieu fees could potentially be used to support below market rate commercial space. And I don't think I've gotten to all of the questions in the chat because we've kind of been trying to focus on people asking questions in real time rather than having two conversations. But if there's something that we missed, please go ahead and raise your hand, and I will also go through the chat and see if there's other things that need to be answered.
Yeah, I would just add, in addition, that I think we had talked about some earlier, but the idea of limiting the uses to more arts and cultural uses in this area is also, hoping that will have the rents, be lower as well, because the competition of the types of uses would be more of, art and cultural, and so that would also potentially reduce the rents from the competition aspect of things. In addition, I did see that Hiroko had also mentioned the idea of cultural easements. So we have heard, I think, from different developers, and this is something, again, it would be a voluntary thing from them as well, but where if you do it like create an easement, a cultural easement, or it can be where a developer can get reduced tax rates for, so the example, like a ground floor use in this instance. So that's something that maybe we can also look at promoting in this area. Offer community ownership, yes. But I think there's also where, like through a land trust type of idea, where if somebody voluntarily says they're going to offer reduced rents in a ground floor space, and they can actually get like reduced tax rates and so forth. So that is, I think, another idea we can look at in ways to help with this reduced rent in ground floor spaces.
Yeah, and I see. So Naomi said, what about potential commercial condo type ownership structure with nonprofit arts organizations as owners? And that relates to something that Ayodele said a little bit ago that said the broad definition of cultural use is good. How will it be tended on an ongoing basis? What happens if the space is unaffordable? Will it remain empty or be filled with some other type of leasee? That's one of the things we're concerned about. And I think both of those we're trying to address by putting together this this tenanting program. So whether that is, I think that gets at what Laura is saying, is like whether that ends up being an ownership model like a land trust, or if it's something where the city would do a master lease to a tenanting organization like CAST, the CAST's Keeping Space program, or something like an Baldsey that's more of a community developer. We're sort of looking into options for that. Do I see a hand up from Darlene?
Yeah, I don't seem to have a hand raise function in this format for some reason.
Go ahead.
But, well, one way to lower the rents on those spaces is to leave them empty. I mean, I've got firsthand experience with that. Seattle went through a whole bunch of neighborhood-based planning and zoned in small commercial on the bottom of all residential properties, and a lot of those storefronts stayed vacant for a long time. And then people of color got to rent them magically. How did that happen? Eventually having things sit empty is not it's not a particularly good equation for developers, but if we keep padding their pockets, they're not going to rent it cheaper. That's not going to happen voluntarily. So sometimes that vacancy rate is exactly what you're looking for.
Yeah,
but you can't have it both ways. You can, I mean, you're either trying to drive the cost, you're trying to drive the rents down, because, or you're not. It's a commitment of doing it or not doing it. I'm not saying it's the end all and the be all. I'm just saying I know that it works. And a lot of artists ended up in those spaces. A lot of artists end up being they even kind of flex the code, I think. I may be a little out of it now because it's been years ago, to make it possible under certain circumstances to have those spaces be live workspaces. They kind of kept fooling with it until they found the model that worked, but they didn't just try to give developers relief as the first thing out of the chute. because the developers are making money from that next floor all the way to the top. They're making
Yeah.
money. They're
Yeah,
making
I
money.
think that's kind of what we've heard, that developers are not really counting on the ground floor spaces to make the money, because that's not where they're
Exactly.
coming for. So
They
that's,
can work it that way. They can work it out. But if we say, well, we have to take care of them on the front end, then they will get market rate for those spaces too. Of course they will. Why would they leave with that on the table?
Yeah, and I think that's part of the thinking behind this arts and culture zoning, where we're requiring that that at least 50% of ground floor space be dedicated to those uses, because it'll limit other uses that might be more financially competitive with the arts and culture uses.
Yeah, what I was referring to was in another city, by the way, not Oakland. I don't think I made that clear. It was the city of Seattle's general plan about 20 years ago. We did a lot of something called neighborhood villages, transit-oriented development, and the ground floors were all required to be relatively small footprint commercial, so you didn't have big box stores coming in either, because it wasn't big enough. It wasn't designed that way. It was designed for mom and pops.
Thanks. And just before I go to Bill, just one more thing on that. You know, we actually talked about maybe requiring some small floor plan spaces. What we ended up doing was requiring there be flexibility so that they could be smaller or they could be larger, so that they could go either way. But that's an interesting. It's interesting.
What's your analysis on what is your analysis on how that's going to work out for small arts organizations or artists or whatever the case may be? What's the analysis if you make it? Well, you can bring a big box store, and if you want to, I mean, I can only do it on the back of a napkin because I'm not an analyst, but I'm pretty sure I can predict the future. I think we should do that analysis. If we're gonna set it aside, it should be based on something.
Yeah.
Who benefits and who's harmed, and how do we know?
Yep, we can look into that.
Thanks.
Yeah, Bill.
So I always love following Darlene. Absolutely. No, well, she actually laid the groundwork for something I was going to suggest that I thought might be a little out the blue, but she helped pave the path for me. I don't know. I know I've mentioned this to some folks here. I don't know if I brought it up in this forum before, but Minneapolis St. Paul had this really great program years back called the Green Line. And I won't go into all the case study of it, but a couple of things strike me that we might want to look at here as well. The two principal analogs, I think, or analogies. One is that they were working very hard to retain businesses of color along this transportation corridor, and also to brand them in a way that they had an aesthetic and destinational character. And again, through some very simple and very effective guidelines around facade enhancements, things of that nature. But they also had a lot of support from a funders collaborative. And I think the McKnight Foundation, which is a local foundation there, was one of the lead points. I don't know to what extent we're thinking, and this is getting more, I know, on the operational side than just on the land use, but all of this is linked, it seems to me. That seeing where we could also, to Darlene's point, knowing who's going to go in there. I mean, really get our idea a little more clear about who we're building for, or who we're creating or crafting the space for. And then being clear about what kind of needs that constituency might have to be successful. So if, as an example, along the corridor in Minneapolis, the McKnight Foundation, I think they were the principal ones who did this, but they have a huge consortium of foundation partners who helped them. They actually spent a lot of time with the businesses there and helping them to understand cash flow, to work with their working capital, things of that nature, and just a little bit of a tweak to help make sure that they were skill setted to really be there and thrive and do well and continue to do well. So it wasn't just about the physical location, but it was also giving some sense of assistance and leg up to really working. So to making a business work. So I think that the idea, what I like, one of the things I like about what Darlene was saying just now is, thinking with the end in mind, who actually shows up, or who are we looking to show up? I mean, we're doing this with an expectation that there's a there. We know there's a constituency we're shooting toward, and then maybe reaching out. And again, this is, Joanna, something, back on us or me or whatever, I can talk to EWD and some other folks. or anyone of our group here, who has had good working relationship with any of the foundation partners within the Bay Area. It just seems to me that as an exercise, what we're trying to accomplish here, that it shouldn't just be a dialogue, solely with the city, solely with the constituency, solely with the developers, that there are gaps to be filled, that none of that cast is going to be able to fill quite so well. And having, again, partners, again, like foundations. I mean, again, I've just seen them do this too many other places, not to think they can't help us here as well, that there also is a role for them to play. So I just think we need to think about that.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the comments we're hearing today are about how the city, in partnership with community foundations, developers, need to have a comprehensive approach to supporting the BAMBD, not just the zoning that we're presenting tonight. Though that's just one piece of it. It is 5:17 and our meeting is scheduled to end at 5:30. We can turn to any more discussion in a moment. Let me just share with the rest of you, or with all of you, the last stages in the process, just so that you know what's coming next for the zoning amendments. And then we can talk about maybe what should happen next for aspects of BAMBD support that are outside the zoning amendments. But let me just quickly share the next steps. So we are going to be completing the public review of the zoning amendments over the next few weeks. Our consultant is, our economic consultant on the zoning incentive program is coming up with some additional information that's been requested from the community. And so once that is completed, we'll be scheduling this study session on the zoning incentive program, as well as how it relates to affordable housing. We have an online survey that we invite you and anyone you know to fill out. We also have some chalkboard surveys in a couple places around downtown that are trying to send people toward the online surveys for a little bit more detail and to find out more about the project. We will be going to public hearings of the Zoning Update Committee and the Landmarks Preservation Advisory Board. Once we've completed that whole public review, we'll be revising the draft zoning amendments. And as I mentioned earlier, taking those zoning amendments along with the revised plan and revised environmental impact report to Planning Commission and then City Council's CED committee and City Council for adoption. If you would like more information or want to have other options for giving us feedback, this is information about our website. There is a summary of changes on there if you want something that you can read through. The economic report behind the zoning incentive program is on there. There are also some videos about the downtown specific plan and zoning if you want to share them with people who didn't attend this meeting but want to learn more. And then we have an interactive draft of the planning code amendments, which include the BAMBD zoning, but include all of the full range of them that I described earlier. And so that's the website is called Conveyo. You can get to it from our main website, but you use this Conveyo tool to make comments directly on the draft. Or you can email us directly at plandowntown.oakland@oaklandca.gov. Please do join our mailing list if you're not already on it. That'll let you know when we have upcoming meetings or other news to share. And Stephanie, would you mind putting the link in the chat again to this presentation so that you can get the links if you need them? And I will stop sharing. So are there any, and I see Eric, some comments on code violations, recommending policy links report on cultural arts and equitable development. Hiroko said, yes, the continuum of a creative economic development strategy. So more of a holistic range of approaches. And then Stephanie put the link to the presentation in there. So does anybody else have any other comments or questions about these zoning amendments? If not, then we'll wrap up for now. Please be in touch if you do have questions or additional comments. Thank you so much for attending this evening's meeting. And we look forward to hearing from you more in the future and working with you more as we go to revise and implement the zoning changes and any other strategies that we come up with to support the BAMBD. Yeah.
Thank you,
so
Joanna.
Thanks, Joanna. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Kwaheri.
Thank you. Good night. Nice evening.
Good night.
Night.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.